This is Lessons Learned, and I'm your host, Matt Kennard, CEO of Better Lesson. Join me as we dig in with visionary state and district level leaders who share our mission to support every K-12 educator in developing the next generation of resourceful, compassionate, and resilient learners. Lessons Learned is brought to you by Better Lesson. Let's get started. All right, Lessons Learned, Season 2, we're back. We're talking about the intersection of college and career readiness and K-12 education. So excited to be joined today by Chike Aguh. He is kindly given up some time. This is a man who does more work than you can possibly believe. Just by way of background, was a teacher and policy official at America's largest school system. He's a board member for the American Student Assistance. He has had his work featured, at Harvard, Wharton, Fast Company, Forbes, Fortune, and Wired Magazine. Previously served as the second Chief Innovation Officer for the U.S. Department of Labor, and is now at Harvard. So, Chike, welcome, my man. You are way busier than I think any of us have time to even contemplate.
Matt, thank you for having me. I was going to say to the audience, I met Matt 15 years ago almost, as we were both aspiring business school students. And it's been amazing to watch the journey since then. And I've known Better Lesson kind of even longer. And so I'm just really excited for the work that you are doing, for the space that you're having. And we need more conversations like this. One, because we have some big trends coming and we need to kind of talk about them. And more importantly, the talk hopefully will guide action. So just excited to be here and dive in.
No, 100%. And I think, I've been intrigued in following your work now that you're a senior advisor for the project and workforce at Harvard. I think the idea of workforce and its intersection with K-12 is a rapidly evolving thing. And so I'm excited to dive into that. We're going to talk about generative AI. So everyone hold your horses. We're going to get into it. But I think before we get anywhere, you mentioned 15 years ago, we're aspiring business school students. We both now have the gray hairs and the tiredness to say that 15 years have genuinely passed. But tell me about your educator journey. What brought you into it? What got you excited about spending a significant portion of your career in the ed space?
Sure. It's really, in some ways, I like to say I spent kind of my career up and down the human capital stack, from K-12 to higher ed to workforce development, to even corporate reskilling, and then across sectors, so public, private, social. I would say that I am a prisoner of biography, as Bill Clinton likes to say. So part of the reason I'm so passionate about this is just my own family's journey. So my family is from a far and out of the way village in Nigeria that most Nigerians themselves will never go to and never see. My grandparents didn't go past middle school. My parents grew up with Peace Corps volunteers in their classrooms. They were born on streets that were unpaved then. They're unpaved now, mostly. And what changed life for them was they got to come to the United States of America as international higher education students in public American higher ed in the late 70s and early 80s. And I am literally the first person in the entire history of my family born in America. And then I got to go on and serve an American president. And in some ways, that is a huge jump to make in a generation, quite literally. And so the question that I've really been focused on is, how do I replicate for others that which has been created for me?
I love that. I love that concept that it is a cycle that we are in many ways indebted to the folks who made it possible for us to continue to make it possible for the next generation of folks who are going to come along. And that part of the journey, many of you know that, I started my career as a banker and a private equity investor and could have stayed in that world for the rest of my life and had a great career. I came in education for a similar reason, which is, how do we start mapping better journeys so that every student is being able to, walk across a graduation stage, be it in high school or college or, directly in industry, and feel like they've got, a meaningful, inspiring journey ahead of them where they can be meaningful contributors to society. And so I love that, and I resonate deeply with that. And I think it dovetails into a conversation that I am glad that we are finally having in American education, which is 4-year college for all is not the only answer for a K-12 education system. If we look at the best systems in the world, there has been a commitment to a variety of outcomes for students, including a deep tie into workforce as a way to ensure that we are thinking about not only productive, meaningful, high wage, high availability jobs for our graduates, but we're also starting to think about the future of work and what that can look like going forward. From your vantage point, GK, whether it's thinking about innovation in the Department of Labor, or now, working on workforce directly through Harvard, or even some of your other experiences, how have you seen that conversation evolve over the last 4 to 5 years, and where do you like to see it continue to evolve to?
So here's what I've seen change over the last, call it even 10 to 15 years. And let's do it from a top down, then a bottom up. What I've seen from the top down is a weird change in the mix of jobs in the American economy. Generally, when you and I, Matt, were coming up, what we saw was the shrinking of the agricultural part of the economy to, I have to look at probably less than 10% now, something like that. A shrinking of the manufacturing part of the economy, probably now a third of U.S. GDP, and then a huge explosion in service. Everything from bankers, consultants, the call center, so on and so forth. And we were always kind of told the future of that U.S. economy is going to be service. And that's certainly what you see in quote unquote more advanced economies. What we've begun to see, particularly with the advance, and we'll talk about generative AI more deeply, is you're beginning to see some erosion in the growth of white collar jobs. You're seeing this slowly in paralegal, accounting services, things like that. Even we're seeing consulting firms and bankers, places that you and I used to work, that are slowing or using technology in new ways. What we've also begun to see is with some of these new technologies that are really going to be critical for American economic and geopolitical competitiveness, a need for more what we would have called manufacturing or blue collar jobs. You can see this in the explosion of interest in HVAC, for example. You can see this in, if you look at commercial space, Blue Origin, SpaceX. When I was in government, we projected that there was going to be a 6-digit amount of jobs needed for these sectors that were not college degree jobs, because we frankly need people just to build the things. So you see that need from the economy. Now let's go from the bottom up. And I think the biggest thing that I have seen is, and I use this term human capital stack. That's what I call it. Because bureaucratically, and again, I've worked on the K-12 level in New York City. I have worked in Massachusetts on the state level. I have worked at the federal level. I have worked K-12. I've worked higher ed. I've worked workforce development. I've worked corporate reskilling. The big thing to take into account and really understand is, let's imagine that you're 20 years old. Let's imagine you are 20 years old, and let's say you dropped out of high school when you were 16, and you want to figure a way to get back in the workforce. You have a ton of options. You could go back to your K-12 system. Most K-12 systems are responsible for you till you're 21 or 22, usually 20 or 21, usually 21. In New York City, that was the prime example. I could have gone back to my high school, re-enrolled, and done like a C2E certificate, or just graduated and either go on to K-12, workforce, whatever. I could bypass my high school entirely. I'm going to go take my GED, and I'm going to go to a community college, and then after that, transfer to a higher ed if I wanted to, so on and so forth. I could try and go straight to a 4-year, so on and so forth, usually with a GED, so on and so forth. I could bypass all of that. I'm going to show up to IBEW or my local union and do an apprenticeship, and within 2 to 5 years, be a journeyman on some type of profession. I don't say any of those paths to say one is better than the other, but if you are a 20-year-old, you have a lot of options. And the challenge is the reality is they don't care which channel they take to their economic opportunity. It doesn't actually matter to them. It matters to us who are in one of those different silos. And this is where, again, at times, the quote unquote adults, our preoccupations at times can swamp what the students or the learners really need. Because, by the way, the learners aren't simply 17 years old anymore. The average age of a student in higher education is in their upper 20s now. We're also thinking about now, when I was in the Department of Labor, thinking about dislocated workers. You might be 40-year-old, years old, 50 years old, trying to figure out, okay, I need to reskill in some way, shape, or form, and I still have lots of options. In some ways, what I want is pick whatever e-commerce site you want to. Pick Walmart.com, pick Costco, pick Amazon, whatever. I'm sure within all those organizations, they have lots of silos and different offices and different divisions and people who commit and fight and so on and so forth. But to me, the consumer, I don't see any of that. All I see
Sure.
is a really slick website where I can get what I want really, really quickly, and it shows up at my door. The point is, ideally, that is how we want someone's education experience to be. They get what they need, and the silos going to protect them and don't matter to them. And I say this particularly for those of us who care about getting kids who don't come from means, who don't come from money, who don't come from privilege, to get the opportunities that they want. Because let me tell you something, the people who can navigate the silos are people who are going to do okay. Because they have people, whether it's their parents, their community members, who can tell them how to guide through it. It's the kid from West Baltimore who's never had someone in their family or their neighborhood go to school, go to higher ed or into the workforce in a consistent way, who can't afford that. And they're the ones who fall through those cracks between the silos. And so my big thing is, how do we get to when everyone realizing it's a human capital stack and the borders between them are or should be more porous than they are, candidly. Slowly you're seeing that. Dual enrollment and CTE in K-12, a bunch of reaching down into even the middle school level by workforce to try and create kind of workforce pipe, to try and create human capital pipelines. And we can name a bunch of others. That is a stack, and that the stack needs to be seamless so that everyone, and I mean everyone, can get to where they want to go. Because candidly, we have an issue, which is we right now don't have enough people to do all the work. We just don't.
No, we don't. And I think what resonates a lot with what you just said to me is, at the end of the day, we need to stop applying what are often, I would say, short-sighted biases to types of work or outcomes for folks, and instead say, hey, listen, how do we help you align what you want to do from, and this is a conversation, I think one of the things you mentioned was reaching down into sixth grade and navigating the silos. The stat that bothers me the most in higher ed. It's the fact that the number one predictor of whether or not you're going to go to college is whether or not your parents went to college. All that says to me is you have an overly complex system that, unless someone has navigated it successfully before, we have somehow not figured out how to do it. Now, as a child who had two parents who were both, went to undergrad and were JDs, the system isn't actually that complex, but we gatekeep it like it is. And instead of saying in sixth grade to families, hey, listen, here are the multitude of pathways. And by the way, we would not be the first education system to say this. Many others around the world actually do this and provide opportunity and have real conversations about skills alignment, soft skilling, right? Like how you can align to jobs of the future. Say to a sixth grader, hey, listen, whether you want to go to a 4-year college, 2-year college, you think medicine's cool, here are your options. You think that manufacturing is cool, here are your options, right? To make it so that whether you're employed, and I really love this. I talked to the director of CTE at Enrico, Mac Beaton, and he just said, listen, enrolled, enlisted, or employed, we want to make sure that you have something that you can persist in, that feels valuable to you, that feels like an inspiring journey for you to be taking. And when you cross the threshold of graduation in high school, it is a meaningful, educational, and life milestone again, and not just a waypoint to a 4-year college. And so I love the idea that you're saying here, which is, how do we make it possible for kids to understand, and not only kids, families to understand, education institutions to understand what it means to provide meaningful communication around and meaningful access to a multitude of points. Because to your point, not everyone's a 17-year-old graduate. Someone's coming back. Someone may have said, I live down here in South Texas. You get a lot of kids who graduate from high school here who say, hey, I'm going to go work the oil fields for 3 years. Why? Because I'm going to make $120,000 a year. I can bank almost all of it. And then you know what? I'll think about going to A&M or UT or wherever else when it's now an affordable journey. Are you going to tell me that's not a productive way to go, that kid did not learn anything by graduating with a plan they can persist in, learn some discipline in the workforce before going back to college, and that won't help them? Come on, that's crazy, right? Like, we should be able to support all of these pathways and understand that actually our long-term future depends on our ability to support all of these pathways.
One of the big things to think about, and I'll take what you say a step further, which is, and I really this was really hit home for me by going to see the Swiss system. And so I'll stipulate up front, all these systems are different, all these countries are different, but I also stipulate there are things to be learned. The biggest thing that I take from the Swiss system is, one, they don't assume that it is a single pathway that has an end. One. Secondly, they assume that the education system is something that every citizen in Switzerland will be in contact with throughout their entire career. Meaning, you may go to your high school and you may decide, hey, I'm going to go into an apprenticeship of sorts. And again, I'll say in the Swiss economy, they have apprenticeships for everything. They have apprenticeships in investment banking, in law. You know, I'm a good friend of mine. Who I met there. He is the COO, excuse me, of one of the units of Schindler. So if you've been in an elevator, it's either an Otis elevator or a Schindler elevator. And he got there through an apprenticeship. He also was thinking about going back to school, to baccalaureate, to go get a degree to do something else. It is assumed that you will cycle back and forth to different parts of the system throughout your career. And so that's one thing. Secondly, it's okay. For them, there is no stigma. There is no, you screwed up. That's just the way it is. That is the viewpoint that we should have. One, we aren't used to that. We still are in America, have a hard time getting our heads around that. And secondly, our system is not necessarily built to make that easy. That's the other thing that the Swiss have done. It is a very easy system. Let me say one last thing, which is whether it's Switzerland, Germany, those systems have a very clear way for particularly industry to make clear what they need, what they want, how what we're teaching in the world of school can match the world of work. So that's another thing. So that's my big thing, which is it should be assumed that everyone will be in contact with this system. And again, if you look at like an example of this that we can learn from it domestically, it's actually U.S. military. Once you become an officer, it is assumed that every few years you will come out of the field, you will go to a war college, you will learn the latest and greatest in terms of American war fighting and also broader things, and we'll send you back in the field. That is the assumption. For you, there's no way for you to ascend up the ranks without doing it. But in other places, we assume that you finish college between 22 and 26, or like formal education between 22 and 26. And then if you have to go back or do anything beyond that, you must have messed up along the way. With how fast things are changing, that actually should be the norm. Again, we'll dive into AI, but just as much as that has changed in 3 years, how could you not have some type of additional training to stay on top of it? So anyway, I love the point, but I'll take it even further, which is we have to create a system that allows people to be in touch with their entire career, starting from when they are in middle school and high school.
And listen, I have to shout out. I mean, you've seen some real innovation, and you see innovation throughout the country. And one of the things I've loved seeing is, for instance, in Ohio, the close collaboration, the Department of Labor and the Department of Education, right? You are going to make this a real relationship. You actually have to start thinking about it in that way. And, I have a chance to talk to leaders from red states, blue states, all across the board. And I think one of the things that I love hearing now is, how do we help make things like high wage, high availability in-state jobs available? So if I'm a West Virginian, I actually know the options that I might not be seeing because I'm in X city versus Y city of things that could keep me in my state, near my family, near my home. And those are great things and great opportunities. We see that, all the time, whether you think about Kentucky and, car plants or whatever else it may be. How do we think about that future of work, that local availability of work, and start gearing our systems to have a very productive conversation with the labor market, be it your Department of Labor in your state, be it, a council of, large industries within the state. If I think about someone like industries within the state, if I think about someone like valuable, my system, because for the kid who's growing up in, let's say Scottsdale, Arizona, where, it's 120 in the summer, but it's a beautiful 75 and sunny in February. Akron's going to be a tough road to hoe if you're going to stay there, versus folks who feel like they have an investment in that local community and want to stay and become, stay in their local communities.
I think that's right. And I think, again, I want to say the last piece here, which is the one that you asked me, what's changed. I think one thing that has also changed is what is something I believe for a while, but I think it's, but maybe the market's catching up. There used to be this big fight between, kind of called a liberal arts education and a kind of industry employee focused, kind of more job training type of education. And these are two things were diametrically opposed. And at least what I have seen in the workplace is professions that we would have historically considered more liberal arts kind of lane or requiring more technical skill. Again, I say right now, you would not hire someone who could not use Microsoft Office or Google search. These AI tools are becoming that in real time. Similarly, when I talk to jobs like in the industrial sector, in the tech sector, what you'll hear from employers are, I need more people who can do these things that we would associate with liberal. I need better critical thinkers, communicators, conflict resolvers. And what I more say is they're not different. They are the same thing. What I say is the just-in-time skills and the timeless skills, and you need both. And for those of us who are in the education space or we're up and down this human capital stack, we have to make sure that people have both. Let me also say one other thing, which you didn't ask me, but on that last point, on those timeless skills, you don't learn them in the classroom. You learn them by doing. You learn them by, and so one thing that I have seen, which I've been very gratified by, is seeing the push towards more work-based learning, whether it's, I've worked at the Department of Labor, the Biden administration, seeing what our unions are doing, particularly with more young people, seeing what more schools are doing. I think Indiana is a state that I think about in terms of having work-based learning be part of that. Maryland, my home state, being one of those, being that the majority of high school students will have a work-based learning experience before they leave high school. And even on the job, you are seeing more and more that people realize, like I don't just teach someone how to resolve conflict; they have to do it. And so those are a couple of things that I've seen that are really powerful themes. But the question becomes, by what infrastructure and what structures do we make available to make that easy? Because people clearly will do what is easy, and so we've got to make sure that we have the structures to make those things that are so important so easy.
We think a lot about that here. Obviously, part of our job is professional learning and upskilling, right? And we talk about human capital management. Professional learning is a key piece of that, but also being able to get into the matriculation pathways of our K-12 students, laying out pathways and creating those communication lanes to kids and families, upskilling our counselors, upskilling our principals, upskilling our district leaders. One of the things I think a lot about is system sustainability. And COVID showed us that we weren't ready for anything that's coming. And I'm going to argue that what's happening in AI is going to be no less disruptive. And it's just going to be a much longer disruption because we need to continue to build our system to be more resilient to change. I had if you haven't checked it out, check the AI EDU podcast. It just dropped today. I heard you talking a lot about, the idea of consistent change that we can't anticipate because it's not necessarily coming out of the things that we were predicting, right? And I appreciated you bringing it up because people forget, right? GPS came out of government work from the 60s and 70s. The internet came out of government work. Sorry, email was the 60s, right? The internet was really the 70s and 80s. We knew personal computing, right? We can go back to, cracking Enigma. We've known for a long time when things were coming. And the Industrial Revolution was, completely upending, right? We saw, the Model T, right? We went from, if you want to just go into the streets of New York, the reason there's steps up into those brownstones? It's because there was horse shit on the ground beforehand. So we went overnight, right? That all went away. An entire industry went away. We think about, hunting whales for oil, right? Once we discovered that we could take it out of the ground, whole industry went away. AI is going to have a very similar impact, and we're not going to have a ramp and a warning, right? And I think that when ChatGPT dropped, we didn't get a warning. All of a sudden, the tools are ubiquitous. It is a requirement, right? If you're not using it every day or figuring out how to use it every day in your life, you're going to be challenged. How do you think about, we can talk about what the future of work in AI is in a second, but what do you think is the key to building better system resiliency? Because we're going to continue to see innovation at a pace that we can't even begin to grok, right? We're going to see 6 months, 3 months, 2 months, world changing innovation.
When I think about innovation, what's going to be required is adaptability of these systems, meaning systems that can reconfigure and change very quickly, or that can change what they deliver very quickly to meet the changing dynamics. Again, well, I've spent a lot of time in this space, and these systems generally, and this is true from K-12 all the way into corporate reskilling, they don't change quickly. And that's a problem when the things and skills that need to be delivered are changing quickly. And again, if you were to look at, to use our old business school term, the S curve for these technologies is much shorter, meaning from when you get to introduction to steady state, cycles that used to be decades or years for AI are what? Quarterly?
If that.
Semi-annually? If that. So the first thing is adaptability. And so to think about this, I think about one of these books that's on my shelf from one of my old bosses, General Stan McChrystal, who used to lead Joint Special Operations nationally, and then also led our forces in Afghanistan. He's written an entire book about this, and I take these points. He has 4 capabilities of adaptive organization, meaning can move quickly in times of uncertainty and change. First is trust. Trust between the different parts of the system. And if we're candid, I'm vice chair of the Maryland Higher Education Commission. If you think about trust between different parts of the human capital stack, trust between different sectors, we don't quite have it. We've all, and trust means you believe in the benevolence, the competence, and the integrity of the people that you work with. We don't quite have that. And it sounds like a very soft thing to start with, but it is very important. Because what you have generally is people reaching into different parts of the stack to at times do things that they've not done before. Some of that's warranted, but some of that comes from, I don't really trust you to do your job, if we're very candid. So that's one. Secondly is what you would call common purpose. Do we all agree on what the mission is? Well, if you read the book and when General McChrystal got to Iraq, he went around and asked people, what was the mission? And he got different answers. And he's like, well, this is part of a problem. What is we can't be here in a battlefield and not agree on what the mission is. And the same thing here. What is it that we are here to do for these learners, for these kids? And we don't quite, and to be candid, we're not quite there yet. We're having fights about this literally right now. Many of which I think are nonsensical, some of which are needed, but we don't agree on what the mission is. If you were to ask me what the mission is that every person who goes through this system can, at the beginning and also consistently throughout their career, get the skills they need to create the future economic needs of the lives that they want for themselves and their families. That's what they want. And by extension, that will manifest into their communities and the country. That's what I would say the mission is.
I'll just jump in to say one thing. I'm just going to extend one point you just made there. And that mission exists in California and in Idaho and in Oklahoma and in Massachusetts. And I think that one thing to say, if we want this system to work, really work, the idea that this flexible, adaptable system exists in all 50 states is in deep relationship to labor and can actually start to push forward the idea of like, what is the next competitive American economic engine, right? Which is going to be reskilling. It's such a key piece.
So now let's go to the next capability, which is shared consciousness. Shared consciousness, very simply, is that everyone knows what everyone knows. So one of the things that's really easy, and I remember this as a classroom teacher, it is really easy to simply be in your silo. I do, not even my school. I know in my classroom, that is what I'm focused on. It would be very easy for a teacher left to themselves to not think about AI at all. The only reason they're thinking about it is their kids are bringing it in. So what ideally you would want is that all the people in the system and outside the system let's be clear, OpenAI was founded in 2014. If you go and you read 10Ks on Microsoft, they talk about AI. Google bought DeepMind, I also believe, in 2014, if I remember correctly. So the thing is, when people talk about artificial intelligence, no one really believed it. Even think about when Facebook went to Meta. You remember the reason they did it because they believed in XR. They believed in crypto writ large. They believed in artificial intelligence. They talked about this candidly, but even to the market, the market don't think paid attention. And I will tell you, none of that was reaching educators in real time until like a meteorite, ChatGPT strikes. And again, I use them just because they were the first to market. But in this first, Gemini, Claude, Perplexity, name all of these tools. So basically, really, really important that everyone knows what everyone knows. Just to give you a sense, but I looked on the battlefield with General McChrystal. He was leading forces, joint force operations in Afghanistan. He had an 8,100 person conference call every day, 90 minutes, with people around the country just to share what people were seeing. And he'll tell you those calls saved lives because people saw things they wouldn't have seen otherwise. Because what they realized they were able to do was share information at the speed of the insurgents that they were fighting. The question is, what would you need to do to share relevant information to all the people in and around the system at the speed of the change? Or as General McChrystal would say, at the speed of the fight. So and then the last piece, and this is a piece that actually America, if you do the first three things, we create trust, we create a common purpose, we create shared consciousness. The last piece is one that we're actually built for, which is what we would call empowered execution, meaning decisions are made at the lowest appropriate level within the system versus the other way around. We're built for that because of our federalism. There is a world where if everyone knows what they need to know, a school, a district can move really fast if they so choose. And I use that last part, if they so choose. By the way, that's true of higher ed, it's true of workforce, so on and so forth, because you have the same dynamics. For those of us who work in this space, we know we're not moving at the speed of the fight. And if I say the fight, it is to make sure that the economy has all the labor it needs to fill high demand, high wage jobs that are going to make us more economically and geopolitically competitive. And so that each one of those people can create the life for themselves that they want and for their children, for their communities, for their country. That is the thing. And I'll use one stat. And this comes from the book, and I'm pretty sure I have this stat right. So if you were to look at raids against the insurgents during the Iraq War, it's now, 20 years ago. Before General McChrystal did those four things, we had 3 to 4 successful raids a month against insurgents. After implementing that over an 18-month period, we went from 3 to 4 successful raids a month to 300 to 400 successful raids a month. Because those three things happened. Again, battlefield, different than schools, higher ed, but there are lessons to be learned. And if you can do those four things, we can get to a very different place. And we're in a place now where we can absorb a change like an AI. One of the things that they would talk about on the battlefield, and I got to work for 2 years and hear this, is he said, we're working in our old bureaucratic way. We could never, ever, ever move as fast as them. They would do something at 9 and they would change practice by 2 because they were decentralized, working with like bulletin boards and chat rooms back in the day. That's how they shared information. Whereas he said, we as the U.S. military, even if we worked in a 24/7 cycle, could never make a decision faster in a 24-hour cycle. We couldn't. Literally, you're a captain seeing something in the battlefield, sending it all the way up the chain, then coming back down, couldn't move faster than 24 hours. We couldn't do it because they were a decentralized kind of amoeba, whereas the U.S. military is structured like a Fortune 500 corporation. Just, it's literally a tailor structure. And so, old, Frederick Taylor assembly line, so on and so forth. So it's just so important. And by the way, I'll say one other thing, which I do think ties to this, is he said the biggest mistake that we made when we thought about that insurgent threat is we assumed they were structured like us. So for example, they would try and find, okay, who's in charge? All right, find who's in charge, and we are going to remove that threat from the battlefield. And I think you all know what that means. But the issue is the organization would keep, frankly, operating. They didn't understand it. Like, wait, we just removed all these people that we thought were in charge. Then they realized no one is in charge. They all trust each other enough. It's crazy to say about an insurgent threat. They know what their mission is, and they're sharing information, and everyone is making decisions on the spot in the field. How do we think we're going to fight them? Frankly, doing what we usually do, which is sort of on the front line, see something, so send it up the chain, send it back down. How do we think we are going to win? And not till we began to take some of those lessons did we start to win. And you can literally see the violence graph after 18 months start to go like this. And if you think of mid 2007, when people will remember casualties start to go down and start to have a more mental situation, the story I just told you is a huge part of that. So the question is, how do we now take those 4 things from the battlefield and put them on this system to not just deal with the current change? I'll remove the word threat and put in the word change. Because by the way, if you go to Google, and I'm going far beyond your question, Matt, and you put in White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, Critical and Emerging Technologies. That is a 4-page PDF that we produced every year when I was in government from the White House on the critical and emerging technologies that we thought were going to change everything. The point that I make, artificial intelligence was only one bullet on a 4-page list. This will not be the first. I'm from Maryland. One of those technologies on the list is quantum computing. Most Americans don't know what that is. You will, trust me. XR, what is coming? Hypersonics. I can keep naming them. And so we're going to have to be prepared for this over the next century. That there are going to be more of these technologies that are going to strike like meteorites, and we have to make sure, are we going to be more ready than we were in 2022?
I think there's an element to this. If you think about the common thread of everything you've talked about here, keeping communication at the speed of innovation is usually your only fighting shot at surviving. And it's not to say that, listen, K-12 education has to do a lot of things. And I think there are a lot of things that we do, to your point, that are timeless skills. Self-reliance, productive struggle, right? Learning to be able to rely on others, work in pairs. But I think the key thing here, and I think this is going to be, whether we're talking about workforce development, higher ed, K-12, reskilling at the corporate level, we're not a separate system. We're all one very large extended system. And our ability to enhance communication, and this is where I think things like professional learning, upskilling, understanding where we're placing our investments, and then understanding that innovation comes from lots and lots of places. Before this, I was COO of a company called LearnZillion. And you know where we found our primary growth? State of Louisiana. Because at the time, John White was leading one of the most innovative open education resource adoption cycles possible, writing as well as adopting external OER curricula. And that entire it's continued to build on innovation. Now, people would say, well, Louisiana is not a top 10 state. No, but Louisiana is a state that is making the most of the resource they had available to make significant shift and change. And by the way, a lot of things that can be emulated in other systems across the country, to the point of how do we share best practices? How do we communicate with each other? And how do we start thinking about this as 50 extensions of one large system that is meant to keep the United States a competitive global power, right? It starts with, can we build an education system that aligns to what, I can call it as hokey as you want, the American dream. People being able to go pursue things that make them happy, make them feel fulfilled, but also align to the high need, high wage, high availability, ultimately changing things that you can go and do. And, building a structure and a system that is able to take that flexibility into account, that builds those communication pathways from K to 12, but then from K to 16, if you want to call it, from K to I've been persisting in my job for 10 years and I want to go do something else. And I want to go try something else, or I feel I'm called or there's a need for me to do something else. These are all communication pathways that we can build them effectively. We don't have to anticipate every change. We're just going to be structured to manage change.
Exactly. It is. I mean, the way I say it is, again, you want to have your eye on the horizon, but you also want to have your feet on the ground. And again, I think you are right. There'll be things that we cannot foresee. There are things that will just happen, particularly with technologies like an AI. But there are a bunch of things. Actually, again, DeepMind, OpenAI, both bought and started in 2014. You can read 10Ks where they are mentioned in company reports. They didn't produce anything for so long. So frankly, I think everyone, including even the market itself, thought it was just, talk. But here we are. And so I think the answer is, how do you do both? But I think that latter piece on how do you structure it, be adaptable, I would argue is as or even more important. And then the last thing I'll say here is, who are the customers? I always say, ideally, what you want is you have a system where on one side is the worker, the learner. Jamie Marisos here, you call say the learner worker, but there is a person who can add value to themselves and to our economy, and there is an employer of some sort over here who has a work that we as a country need done and that they need done, and our job is, how do we create a bridge between the two? And everybody else is in the system. That's your job, whether you are in part of that capital stack, whether you're a nonprofit, whoever else you are. Your job is to create that bridge between people who can do work in it's high wage, high demand, and that can lift up themselves and the country. That's the mission. And so it's always going back to kind of some basic customer service. Who are the customers? The silos are not the customers.
That's right. It's humans. And until we stop thinking of it as a machine and start thinking about it as a human enterprise, we're going to get stuck in some ways that are never helpful. Well, I know this has been, we've gone into some deep areas. I'm excited about people hearing this conversation, but I got to ask you my favorite wrap-up question, Chike, which, we've talked about a lot of change and a lot of need for change and some of the uncertainties that we're facing. But I also think that there's a lot of reason for hope. You've been in this world for a long time. You've thought about it. What makes you hopeful about the future? What do you see coming that makes you say, you know what, as hard as this is going to be, I see the light at the end of a tunnel?
I'll say two things, and then they're kind of intertwined. One is something that has always been true. From when I was working in New York on the K-12 side to higher ed to workforce, no matter how challenged or dysfunctional a school district you found or a college you found, you would always find in any school, almost without fail, there was one classroom that worked, where you would go in and you're like, well, kids are learning. Kids are happy, supported, thriving, and learning in this room. And usually it was a combination of an amazing instructor plus the right confluence of family support from through this. And you can go forward to higher education, to workforce, even on the corporate reskilling side. Even in the most dysfunctional systems, you will always find someone who was delivering on behalf of those two big customers. The thing that makes me even more hopeful is when I think about technologies like AI, and we're seeing it. Those technologies can actually hyper empower those kind of, it's almost educational entrepreneurs, and help them scale those practices across. I think about when I was a teacher, God, I wish I'd had ChatGPT, not because it would have made lessons for me, although it would have helped. But when I think about just starting off with taking things off my plate that we're not teaching and learning, that would have been huge. I had freedom a third of my time just doing that. Then secondly, of course, coming up with lessons that may have been actually, frankly, more organic, more authentic to my kids. And again, we did an amazing job. But like many schools, we were working with usually pre-done curricula, very well-meaning, very expensive, so on and so forth. But God, what we could have done with kind of a hammer and anvil, like a GPT or a Claude. So I think what I'm hopeful for is always, in no matter how challenging the circumstance, there is someone who is teaching and there are students who are learning. At times, even in spite of the circumstance. Always been true. And with these new technologies, that can frankly help make that a lot easier than it was before. Because what you always found was, and the reason it was never scalable is I can't just take an enterprising individual and that be my solution. That's not how it works. Even again, think about the companies that you've worked in. The best companies that you've worked in are companies that didn't just have the right people, they had the right structures to make those people successful. If you have great people and bad structures, you only make so much more money before those people leave or something falls down. You also can't have great systems and even mediocre people because you just don't get the scale of change that you want. You've got to get both. And I think that the technology plus the people are going to be how we get there. I think the last thing that makes me hopeful, and I'll make this very K-12, the current young folks get a lot of shade thrown their way. The Gen Z, I think you and I are millennials. I remember this as well. You can go back in history. You can always find, I have never found an old generation who speaks well of the younger generation. As a whole, I've never seen it. You can go back. Think about the way that the World War II folks, the greatest generation, talked about the boomers, our parents. It was not kind. It was not kind. I preface that saying, when I think about the young people that I've gotten to work with, when I think about when I was in government and I think about the 21, 22-year-olds I worked with sometimes, or I think about when I was teaching some of the young teachers who I would see come in, straight out of school, or when I think about young people who are working in nonprofit versus when I was a nonprofit CEO, they give me great hope. One, they work hard. All this, they don't want to work. I have not seen it. I'm sure there are some adults who don't like to work hard. Like some older people don't like to work hard. But I have seen amazing hustle. Two, amazing values. And again, the benefit of getting older is that you see nuance, you see gray, which is really important. But at times you can forget, no, there are some things that are true. And young people will always remind you. And at times we as adults will use nuance as an excuse to not do the thing that's right. And young people will always call that out. And I appreciate it. I really do. And then the last piece, which is again, a benefit of youth. They don't know what's been. So again, the benefit of being older is you've seen what's been, you can learn some lessons, but the downside of being older is you can assume the future has to look like the past. Young people don't have that. They weren't there. And they get times to say, wait, why do you do it though? Well, we've always done it this way. Well, for real, why? And then as the adult, initially we feel like we're challenged, but then if we're wise, we sit and we think, why do you do it that way? That actually doesn't make any sense at all. So I'd say the educational entrepreneurs who are always making it happen, particularly on behalf of those who are most challenged, the technology, and the young people themselves.
You know what I love about your hope? Your hope is not in the system. Your hope's not in the technology. Your hope's in people. And I think that that's the important part of all of this. The key is communication. That's a human endeavor. The key is rapid evolution of the way that we work with each other. And that's a human endeavor using tools. And I think it's interesting because millennials, I think the reason we may be soft, at least in the way the Gen Xers weren't with us, is we see Gen Z as a second consecutive generation, and Gen Alpha as well, third consecutive generation, that are going to see seismic change. We were the internet generation. Our world was and is fundamentally different in a way that you can never walk back. That is a one-way door. AI is another one-way door. And I think that what I'm happy to see is we have a whole generation that didn't grow up with the idea that Skynet was coming to get us, but instead can really think about the possibilities of what will be and what will come. And, just one last plug for Gen Z. They're kind. There is a kindness in Gen Z that is incredible.
And not just, I think, people to people, but also how do you have kindness be part of a system? How do you, and I think they're deeply thinking about that. And I think there was an assumption that to be effective, you have to be unkind. I'm going to say, now let me be clear, you have to be hard-nosed, you have to be dogged. When I think about the best leaders that I've seen, Again, I think about my old boss, General McChrystal. No one would call him soft. No one would call him soft. But another word I might use is dignity. He is, I think about Julie Sue was Secretary of Labor when I worked there. Marty Walsh was Secretary of Labor before her. Deeply cognizant of people's dignity. Number one, in the people that they were working on behalf of, but also the people that they were working with. And I think you keep saying this is a human endeavor. And I really like that phrase. And it is. And to be candid, the work of this country is a human endeavor. The day that we forget that is the day that's the day I get cynical about America. I'm not there yet. Many are, I am not. And so my belief, and what I love about what you're doing, what I think we all need to do is that we need to keep this human endeavor going. And in some ways, make it even more human, even in light of all the technology that we are seeing.
You know, I know you'll resonate with this because I think you're a Star Trek guy. As much as we've thought of Skynet and as much as we've thought about the end of humanity because of AI, we also thought of Star Trek and the idea that we can marshal our resources to the greater exploration and greater good. And, you know, the beauty of humanity is the fact that we can do both. Yes, the risk is that we do one, but the beauty of what we do is that we can do the other.
It's exactly right. Our job is to capture the promise and mitigate the peril. That's our job.
100%. All right. Lessons learned. This was a barn burner. I had a lot of fun on this one, but you know, Chike, thank you for coming on.
Thank you.
Appreciate having you here. For those of you who are wanting to hear more about lessons learned, please come check out the podcast at betterlesson.com/podcast. This is a great one. I'm excited to see this one hit the airwaves. Chike, thank you, sir.
Thank you.
That wraps another episode of the Lessons Learned podcast. Thank you for listening. For show notes and more about Better Lesson, please visit betterlesson.com/podcast. Lessons Learned is hosted by Better Lesson, the leading provider of data-driven, high-impact, system-wide K-12 teaching and learning solutions. We partner with states and districts to support every educator in developing the next generation of resourceful, compassionate, and resilient learners who are college and career ready. Our work has impacted more than 80,000 educators and nearly 3 million students nationwide. See you in the next episode.